Welcome, Leah, to the podcast.
Hey, yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. I have been listening to your podcast. By the way, I'm so impressed. When I listen to your podcast, Psychotherapy, I feel like I'm watching like a show on Netflix or something. You know, when you have a really, really good book and you can't put it down, that's what your podcast feels like. Just exceptional and talking about such a sensitive topic. Anything that has to deal with, our traumas and then going to therapy. When I first heard the title, Psychotherapy, I thought it was a podcast about therapy, psychotherapy. And then when I learned that it's the psychotherapy, I thought, what a clever name, because it's about harm that can happen in therapy. Is that right?
It sure is. That's right. I have my sister to thank for picking that name out. But yeah, I really appreciate the compliment. We wanted to make it entertaining because that's where education usually happens, is through entertainment. But we also wanted to do it in a way that still honored people's stories and shed light on this topic that is really not talked about near enough.
That is brilliant. And that's really what comes through. We're able to take it because it's such sensitive subjects, as I said, and yet the way it's formatted, I listen to, I think, all of them. I'm up to date with them. They're really good. And I have had people in the past who have had therapy harm talk about their story, but I also wanted to get to know you a little bit about what brought you to therapy. And obviously, when you're creating a podcast, it's because you want this issue that has happened to so many people to be understood and for people to not feel so helpless and hopeless when things like that happen. What really touched me was in this situation is that when people go for therapy, they go because they're at a place in their life where their past is really starting to interfere with their current life and their current functioning. And maybe they have a lot of dysregulation or inability to be present, or they get angry often, just like the triggering. And also those feelings show up that are very reminiscent of the past. And that drives us to go to a trusted person and receive good help. And so it breaks my heart to know that there are people who are that vulnerable, as you were, and as the stories that we hear in your podcast. And then on top of the traumas that they've experienced and they're going for help, it's an added huge another layer. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't expect that you're going to be harmed in similar ways and then have those harms compounded by someone you thought was going to help you.
I had to take a breath for that because it takes so much. I mean, the listeners know, I know, it takes so much, especially if we've had an experience in our past, which relational trauma, where people weren't safe. And it takes a lot to trust a person, an authority figure, because we learned as children that authority figures aren't safe. And to our minds, going for help is with an authority, someone who's an authority in this field that's going to help us. And so there's all kinds of feelings. It takes a lot to go in there and be vulnerable.
It's true.
I think what would be helpful is maybe just to give us just a little snippet of what was going on in your life that brought you to a place where you thought, okay, I need to go for support, if you feel comfortable sharing anything.
Yeah, really. So I grew up with parents who were children when they started having children. And my dad comes from a background of so much trauma, generational trauma, but he's also a first generation immigrant. And he and my mom met in high school and got married at 15 years old. My mom was 15. I think he was 16. And there was just a lot of dysfunction the whole way through. My dad was violent. My mom was very depressed and dissociated most of the time. And after their divorce, my dad, he became unhinged. And it was a messy divorce. But they also jumped into new marriages really quickly. My dad was out of the picture for the most part. He remarried a woman from Lebanon and just kind of started a new life. But my mom married a man who, honestly, the best way I can describe him would be to say that he was relentlessly cruel. I had never been exposed to anything like that. And it was just one thing after another with the amount of abuse that happened. And I won't go into too much detail about it, but I will say that there was a distinct before and after where I went from a very happy and secure child to someone who was very angry and hostile and reactive to when I moved out in high school. I really thought, well, that's going to be behind me. So I moved out, and guess what? It wasn't behind me. It had followed me, but I wasn't making the connection. I'm having these really, I'm overreacting. I'm still angry. When I say reactive, I could kind of fly off the handle easily. Relationships are hard for me. Making and keeping friends is difficult. I'm really embarrassed by this. It's it's funny that it's like I know that these things are happening. I'm having these reactions and I don't want it to be true, so I'm trying to pretend it's not true. I don't feel like I have control over some of my behavior or my thoughts or my moods. And I'm ashamed of them, but I don't want to sit with that shame. So I'm just trying to shove it down and just, kind of pretend it's not there. Do you relate to that?
Do I relate to that 100%? And I think everybody listening, and that's why it's so helpful to hear other people, because it just validates that this is normal. These are responses after trauma. Yeah.
I started college late. I grew up in a home where we didn't really talk about school. It wasn't the focus. Now, I barely graduated high school. I think I had a 1.5 when I graduated. I had a really late start to college, but I ended up moving to Florida when I was about 21. And I went to a small university on the Atlantic coast and I got a degree in biology. I met my husband while I was in school. And my husband is the type of a guy where he's just lovable. People like him a lot. And when you meet him, he's just warm. He feels warm and safe. And I liked him right away. And we fell in love. And it was like, I can't eat, and can't sleep kind of love. He and I both knew we were going to get married. But before we were engaged, I'm still starting to have reactions. And internally, I'm feeling this like, all I can call it is panic. It's a push-pull feeling of, I do love him, but it doesn't feel safe. I don't know why it doesn't feel safe. And so this is still going on inside of me. And after we're married, there's still things happening, but I'm trying to control it through diet, through exercise. Again, control, without understanding what I'm trying to control. And it wasn't until I had my first child where I just feel like things came laser focused to me. And there's this one very poignant moment where I'm sitting with my son, maybe in the first month I have him home, and I'm looking at him and I'm flooded with love for this little boy. I know not every mom loves the newborn phase or has that connection. So I understand that it's not this way for everybody, but it's the first time in my life where I have experienced love in a way that I'm not expecting anything back. I just love this person for who they are. And I would do anything. And I remember promising my son, I'll never let anything harm you. And as I'm saying it to him, I'm realizing that why didn't my mom protect me? Why didn't she protect me from my stepfather? And so it's at this time I'm realizing, okay, we'll do things for our kids that we won't do for ourselves. So I know I'm going to get help for anxiety, for anger, for depression, and I'm dancing around all these things. I'm dancing around the root cause and just treating symptoms. And then after my third child is born, my youngest, there's a few things going on. And it sort of comes to a head where I feel like I'm white knuckling it. One of them is I had become a Christian when I was about 18, and it provided a great safety net for me at that time. If you have a traumatic background, we look for certainty. And for a while, this was great for me. It gave me a community. It gave me a sense of an identity and the idea that there was a Father in heaven who loved me, which it was just a safety and security that I hadn't had. And now I'm at a place where I'm questioning my faith, and I had never done that before. And it was anxiety inducing. I didn't lose my faith. And I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about it, because when you're in really like those strict evangelical culture or circles, people are threatened by doubt. And it's almost like a disease that they feel like could be contagious. I'm not saying this is every circle, but this was definitely in mine where I felt scared to talk to people because I was afraid of losing my community.
That makes so much sense.
And additionally, my sister and I had started writing a memoir, and things that I hadn't talked about or even really thought about since childhood are on repeat. And for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to have anxiety attacks again, and I can't sleep, and I'm on edge and irritable in a way that I hadn't been in a long time. And then finally was that I have this sweet little girl she's my youngest daughter, and she just is the most like me. And she was imaginative, sweet, funny, and like she's doing these things that remind me of me when I was her age. And instead of just enjoying it, I'm like my breath catching in my chest. And I'm like, that reminds me of me before. And it's reminding me that there's a before. And instead of just enjoying my daughter, it's reminding me that something was taken from me. And so I'm really struggling during this time. And my best friend is also going through a hard time in her personal life. And she says, I've been seeing this amazing counselor. He's very skilled. Her pastor is also seeing him. And so is the pastor's wife, which they're people that I respect. And so I make an appointment to go see him. My very first appointment with him, I'm sitting in the lobby and I have a panic attack. And I'm texting the sister. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't believe in therapy. I've gone in the past and it never worked for me. And you know what? This guy looks like he bites his nails, which is really unfair, right? But he comes back and he gets me. He's an older man, not older, but he's a little older than me, and he's in his 60s. We go back into his office, and the second I sit down on his couch, I kind of burst into tears. I'm so embarrassed. My house was a house where you weren't allowed to cry. You were mocked and told you were trying to be manipulative if you were crying. So I'm really ashamed that I'm crying in front of him, and I keep apologizing. And he looks at me and he says, who told you can't cry? And I was like, it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it was like he just understood it. And I don't remember anything else from that session, but I was like, okay, he gets it. And so I made another session. And the second session, he talked almost the entire time. And it was odd to me that it was like a job. I felt like it was a job interview for him, where he was very braggadocious and he gave me his background. And it was impressive too. He had studied law, he had been a CFO, he had a really successful career in sales. And his wife had been a pediatric oncologist. She had been Miss Auburn. He said one of his kids had been to the Olympics. Just an incredible background, okay? And it was intimidating. But he was kind of setting up this narrative of and he even said this. He said, I didn't need to be a therapist. He kind of justified what he was saying as look, I did all these things. I don't need to be a therapist. I was making a lot of money doing other things. He says, I'm basically in this to serve other people now. But it creates this environment in me where I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to be honest with this guy? How will he understand where I have come from if he's got this background and I'm going to tell him the most embarrassing things that I wouldn't tell anybody? I come back this went on actually for a few sessions where he's just talking about himself. But the more he talked, the more I understood. Yes, in the beginning he was braggadocious, but I kind of started to understand why as he talked, where we're exchanging stories, and he would break down crying, telling me about horrible traumas from his past. Now, I didn't.
I'm sorry. The first red flag. Now, I'm saying this now. If it was my first time going for therapy and I have no experience, and I'm saying that they are the expert, so whatever they do and however they act is 100%, because that's what I thought. If someone with authority, they're right 100%. Well, that's a huge red flag. Why is he doing all the talking?
Yeah. Yeah, no. And I something about it did seem off to me. And I'll say this. So as far as red flags in therapy go, I think most people can relate to that little weird feeling in your stomach. This doesn't feel totally right. But it's a double-edged sword, because when you have been traumatized, you don't really make the connection with that gut feeling. I felt it, but then very quickly, I think where somebody who might have a healthier background would say, something doesn't feel right here. I'm not going to keep seeing this guy.
My gosh, can I stop you? Because that is so important to stop you. Because if we have been used to bypassing those signs and signs telling us something's not right, something's uncomfortable, we've just been used to that. Of course, it makes sense that we would not be paying attention when something might be significant because we're so used to not listening to those signals.
I also think it's part of being a woman too. You don't want to be mean, right? And I will say there's the evangelical piece too, where it's like, oh, I don't want to be judgmental. I don't want to judge him. And maybe I'm just being unkind in my thinking. But some of the things that didn't feel off, it wasn't just how much he talked. It was that he had like this sense sometimes, it wasn't all the time, because he could be very kind. He could be very charming. But he also had this arrogance that was sometimes there. And it felt familiar to me. And when I say familiar, what I mean by that is something about him kind of reminded me of my father and my stepfather. Now, I think a therapist might say, well, maybe this is transference, where it's a perception or perceived. And maybe some of that was happening, but I also think it was grounded in truth, especially because of how things unfolded later. But the more he shared about his life, about his own traumas, and the way he would break down crying, sharing stories with me, he had been very neglected as a child. He had lost a brother to cancer, and I had so much compassion for him. I really did. And it helped me to understand why he was so braggadocious. He was a kid who grew up, the joke in his house was the only way they would know if he was dead is if he started to smell.
I'm sorry, but I'm like, you're learning about his traumas and his wounds, and it's helped you to be more compassionate towards him. It's just so upside down. So flag number one, if your therapist is doing most of the talking, that's about themselves, that's a big red flag, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yes. Which brings me to my next point. Very early, I started Googling, is it normal when your therapist says, is it normal when your therapist does? Like, I'm twisting myself into knots to figure out if certain behaviors are normal. And it's taken me a long time to kind of figure out, because at the time, like you said, you just come in and you assume they're the expert. You don't even know what the red flags are. Most people don't until after it's too late. But with the way he is self-disclosing, and that did come up when I Googled red flags, self-disclosure, but it didn't say why. So let me talk about why it was so harmful, the amount of self-disclosure and hyper-emotional involvement he had. It's creating this deep sense of intimacy. It's creating a kind of exploitative kind of attachment to him. And because he doesn't feel safe to me, something feels off. And you put that together with sharing your deepest traumas with somebody and the fact that sometimes he's really rude and demeaning to me. And then other times I feel so heard and so seen and so cared for. You put that all together and it created in me a really unhealthy attachment. And it shifted the focus of therapy over time, where even when we're talking about me, I'm somehow focused on making sure that I'm keeping his favor. Like if I package myself in a way that's easy for him to navigate, and I don't say anything that he doesn't approve of, I'll get more positive feedback and affirmation from him. I've never had a relationship with a man that wasn't either sexual or abusive or both. And I'm in this intimate relationship with him where aspects of him remind me of my abuser, and I'm getting affirmation. And I don't know how to describe it other than it felt addictive. That I really, really wanted to prove my worth to him and stay in a place where I felt like he liked me. As time goes on, he must have told me 5 times that his wife was Miss Auburn. And I was curious about what she looked like. So I started Googling, and Auburn has a website with a whole list of their former Miss Auburns, and his wife's name wasn't anywhere on the list. So that kind of was the first crack in the mask. But then once I started Googling, I couldn't stop. And just about everything that I could confirm, I couldn't confirm everything, but what I could turned out to either be a gross exaggeration or a lie. Like, she hadn't been Miss Auburn. He had never gone to law school. He hadn't been a CFO. As far as elected office, I mean, I could find one failed attempt, but I couldn't find anything in public record anywhere about him holding office. And I had no way of telling him or confronting him about this without sounding like a stalker. And I was so embarrassed that I had Google searched him. I'm like, how am I going to bring this up? But also, I was a little nervous. What if I confront him and he gets angry and he discards me? I was so worried about that, which kind of honestly, let's get into complex trauma. Why am I so worried about being abandoned? Right? I've been abandoned by a parent. And he actually had diagnosed me with complex PTSD. And he had given me Body Keeps the Score, which was such a helpful book to understand myself. I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier. I want to stress the fact that harmful therapy can still be helpful. And that is part of what makes it so confusing, because they helped me, but they also harmed me. And it's so hard to parse out the pieces that led to the harm when they're mixed with being helpful. And so he diagnosed me with CPTSD, which really has been helpful in understanding what flashbacks look like, what certain reactions look like, why I do what I do. And as time goes on, I feel like there's a shift in kind of the way we're interacting. And now he often brags about what a good husband he is and how he and his wife have such a secure attachment. So when he starts making comments that I perceive as flirtatious, it's confusing. And I find I'm gaslighting myself, because it's like, no, he wouldn't have meant it that way, because, he talks about how connected he is with his wife. So if you're perceiving it that way, it's just in your head. So like, he occasionally referenced how beautiful he thought I was. Like yeah. And I thought, well, maybe that's just, one time he had handed me his glasses and he had me try them on and he said, beautiful, just like I thought. Like, well, maybe he didn't mean it that way. And then, or like another time he had mentioned I was beautiful, just like his daughter. So, okay, like, oh, like his daughter, right? But I feel like, especially now after I've interviewed other people, there's a gradual desensitization in the kind of comments somebody who's grooming will make. And it'll be pushing the boundary a little bit further with the uncomfortable comments every time. And so there's one specific moment where I had told him my first exposure to sex was through literature that was violent. It was like sadomasochistic. And it had shaped how I thought about sex for a while. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, and we moved past it. And a couple weeks later, we were getting ready to start the session, and we weren't talking about anything related to sex. And without context, I can't stress this enough, without context and out of the blue, he leaned forward and he looked at me and he said, am I your torturer? Do you think of me as your torturer? And he sat there and he watched me for my reaction, which was to freeze. I mean, I think my mouth must have been hanging open. Like, what do you mean by that? But I just sat there staring at him. He kind of had like a playful grin on his face. And without explaining, he just moved on like he never said it. I still don't, to this day, I'm like, is there any clinical reason he could have had for saying that? I don't think so. But I was too ashamed to tell anyone. I didn't mention it to anyone for at least 6 months because it was embarrassing. But things like that continued. And there were certain things that were like non-sexual touch, where he led me out of the office with his hand on my lower back, or like playfully like shook my hand and like pulled me out of the chair. And all these things together paint a picture, but one by itself, one thing here, one thing there, okay, not a big deal. But it was just, there was like a slow buzz in a horror movie of like a building, like something's going on here. But is it in my head? I went and I talked to my best friend about it. And I kind of hinted like, hey, you think maybe let me tell you some of this? And she looked at me angrily and she said, no. Like, basically, it's in your head. And it shut me down right away. And I was like, okay, no, it's me. I'm the problem. I actually recommended another friend go to see him. And this is another really close friend of mine. Her and her husband were going to start seeing him, or needed somebody to talk to about their marriage. And so I recommended him. And after 2 sessions, she called me and she said, hey, have you ever noticed he lies or exaggerates for no apparent reason? Oh my gosh, I was so embarrassed. I was embarrassed because I knew that about him. I knew that about him and I recommended him anyway. Mind you, at this time, I'm still thinking the only problem in our therapeutic relationship is the fact that he's dishonest. Not any of the boundary blurring, like he had joined my best friend's church. Where the husband and the wife are pastor and pastor's wife. Okay. And this isn't like a mega church where you're not going to run into your therapist. This is 40 people attend. You're doing life together at this church. Sorry, I hate that saying, but that's, they really are. They're in community with each other. So he's blurring boundaries with them. And then he's also keeping me well over the allotted time for our sessions. So there's just a lot going on. But really, in my head, the only thing that he's doing wrong is being dishonest, but making excuses for him because he has this traumatic background. So after my girlfriend says to me that she thinks he's dishonest, I'm like, oh, gosh, okay, I'm going to have to confront him. And in my mind, I think I'm just going to bring this up to him and he's going to be a little embarrassed. He's going to own it and take accountability and we'll move on. It'll be trust building for us. That's not how it went. So I write him a letter and we meet up.
You wrote him a letter?
I wrote him a letter and said, hey, because I knew I'd chicken out in person. So I told him, some of my suspicions and what had happened. And I wrote it in a way that was like the most meek, mild, make excuses for you. Can we talk about this? So as I'm sitting in his office, he's walking in and he looks at me and he says, well, have you ever lied? I'm sorry, I know that's not fair, but have you ever lied? So immediately I'm on the defensive and I'm like, well, yeah, of course I've lied. And I bring up in this Auburn thing and I told him about the website and he goes, of course there's a website now. And I'm not joking, as if I didn't hear him just say that. He's like, well, I never said that. I said, what? He's like, no, I never said that. I'm sorry, I wouldn't say that. I don't remember. And I'm like, you said it to me and several other people at least, 2 or 3 times. In reality, it was like 4 or 5 times. He got furious with me and he said, well, was it 2 or 3? And I got scared and I kind of backed down. Then I go into some of the other things and he's talking. I honestly can't even repeat the things that he said because none of it made sense. It was just like a barrage of words coming together in a way that exhausted listening to. And I know now they call that word salad, but that's what's happening. And so at the end of the conversation, he says, well, if you don't trust me, we can talk about you seeing someone else. Oh my gosh, panic. I'm feeling like I'm so bad. I have to see somebody else. He says, and I looked at him and I said, well, is that what you want? And he's got tears in his eyes and he says, not at all. Oh, and I felt loved. He cares so much about me. He's crying over the idea of me leaving him as his client. Well, that's enough for me. I said, okay, well, let's drop it. And he said, it's okay. He's like, you do have trust issues with men. And I'm like, yeah, I do.
So there's absolutely zero accountability.
Zero accountability.
I mean, no. Walk in and say, do you ever lie? It's like he's just gaslighting you.
Totally. But then, and I had heard the word gaslighting before, and now it's a buzzword everybody uses you're disagreeing with me, you're gaslighting me. But this was like, he put on a clinic of what textbook gaslighting looks like. I left his office so confused and really doubting myself and kind of feeling like I was going crazy. And when I called my best friend when I got home, because she had known about the conversation and what was going to happen. And as I started to tell her about it, she stopped me and she said, you know what? You probably shouldn't talk to me about this because I don't want it to affect my relationship with him. And I was like, I think I should tell the pastor and his wife because he's working out of their church. And she said, no, you shouldn't repeat it. That's gossip. Okay. That made sense to me. And honestly, I have a history of keeping secrets to protect abusers. So this actually really did make sense. But a whole week went by and I felt like I was in fog. And I wrote him a letter and I was like, I just don't think I can see you anymore. And as I started telling people kind of started turning on me. It was weird and I didn't expect it. Like I reached out to the pastor at least 3 times and his response was to block me and my spouse on all social media. I reached out to his supervisor. And when I went in to talk to his supervisor, as I told him the story, even looking back, his face looked panicked. He stopped me and he looked at me and he said, do you feel like he was grooming you? I had never heard the word grooming in the context that didn't have to do with children. So I looked at him and said, I don't know. And his face was panicked. His eyes just went wide. And the meeting kind of abruptly ended, and he refused to take a call from me after that. So my best friend, the supervisor, the pastor, they will not speak to me about this. And I'm left feeling like I've really done something wrong. Obviously, this is my fault. A lot of other people see him and they think he's great. So it must be me. So I write Scott a letter and I take full responsibility. I'm really sorry for the way I handled this. Please forgive me. And I'm hoping at this time that he will repair the rupture and he will take me back as a client. And he responds with 2 words: thank you. He was thanking me for apologizing to him, for confronting him. It was just like this major gut punch. And a couple weeks after this, he has my best friend and her husband up to his cottage in the mountains. So it just feels like there's a triangulation and a silencing happened that I wasn't prepared for. And I couldn't understand it at the time, but I fell into a really deep depression and I couldn't eat for almost a month. And I feel unhinged. I'm just like, I don't know what's happening or why I'm reacting this way. And I just know I'm not going to talk to another therapist about it.
I just feel for you because it's crazy making, and then you feel like you're the bad person
Yeah,
apologizing.
I know. So after about 3 months of being in this state of depression, and really what it did for me is it confirmed this relentless inner critic in my head that told me I was worthless, that told me if anyone really knew you, they wouldn't want to be around you. And this was a man I had said secrets to him that I had never even said to myself, and he knew me better than anyone. And at the first sign of conflict, he discarded me and couldn't get rid of me fast enough. And so that's how I feel. It's bringing back all this stuff from childhood, and I'm feeling like I'm so bad, nobody wants to know me. So for about 3 months, this goes on, and my sister says, Leah, you need help. And she even goes to the point of saying, like, I think you should do inpatient. And that scared me. I was scared of inpatient. So I was like, okay, I'll find someone. And the first 2 therapists I went to were not empathetic at all. They almost seemed, and this is very common for therapy harm survivors, to be treated like you're a danger or you're a threat.
Yeah.
So I was shocked by that. And again, it made me feel like maybe I am the problem. I had a friend recommend this female psychologist. She said she changed my life. Just give her a try. And she's this cool chick from Detroit that was, I mean, I still see her to this day. She is so great. And when I sat in her office, I told her a little bit and she looked at me and she goes, that's fucked up. And it felt so good. I don't know how to describe how good it felt to hear somebody tell me you're not crazy. The situation wasn't right.
Yes.
And so over the course of almost a year, she really patiently parsed out all the details, and it helped give language to me because I knew something really wrong had happened. But at that time, all I could get out was like, he's not who you think he is. That's all I could say. He's fooling you. She was supportive of whatever I wanted to do. And I said, I think I want to file a complaint. But the truth is, I wanted to file a complaint because I was still thinking, I just want him to know how much he hurt me. And it's funny because that's the same thing I felt about my stepfather for years. I just wanted him to know, like, maybe if I say it in a different way or this way or that way, he'll finally hear me. And I finally understand that's never going to happen. Like, this man, because I would defend him even in session with her. And I would say things like, no, well, maybe he didn't mean it like that. He's really kind. He's caring. And she looked at me and she said, girl, this man does not care about you. And I burst out laughing because it was so blunt and I needed to hear it. And she said it over and over again. And she's right. His actions speak louder than his words. This man did not care about me. And after I filed the complaint, I just had this sense of relief. But I didn't get the validation I wanted. You know, I filed a complaint with the state. And they called me, an investigator called me one time, interrupted me halfway through, never followed up with any other witnesses or even, you know, my husband for that matter. And of course, it was dismissed. I still feel good about filing just because filing puts bad actors on the radar of the state. So if he gets other complaints, the state will see he's had priors, and it just builds a paper trail. So in the aftermath, though, trying to understand what happened to me, I searched the internet. I looked for podcasts. I looked on, social media, wherever I could, trying to find stories that were relatable. And I did find some, but there just weren't enough. I found Clients Harmed by Therapy on Facebook. And it is a great resource to any of your listeners who've been harmed by a therapist. Clients Harmed by Therapy is a group of survivors of therapy harm, made up mostly of women who are really supportive. And it's been great. I really do feel like it's helped give language to what happened to me. But what inspired me to start a podcast was that I just wanted someone to listen to me. I couldn't get anybody to listen to me. So I started this podcast, and I wanted it to be a place where other survivors could share their stories too. And I wanted it to be a resource. And so that really was the motivation. And my brother-in-law, it just happened, he had just moved back into town. He's a former therapist and he's a writer. And he took this project on with me, and he's been so awesome. His name is Leah Denton. And I really think some of the magic that you talked about for the podcast being the way it is I'd have to credit him for.
It just makes me so happy to see that you have family that's supportive. Bo, that's just so wonderful. And I love what you said about doing the podcasts and using your voice so that you can be heard, just the way our brain works, and that it connects this to this, to this, to this. So what I'm saying is that as you're using your voice for what happened, it's also connecting to that little girl that had no voice is using her voice. She's on a microphone now speaking to the whole world about harm and how to begin to notice red flags and what to do and help people become empowered. So she'd be really proud of you today that you're doing that. Do you think that having this podcast is also helping you in terms of your own?
Absolutely. Yeah, it has been huge for me in the process of healing. And I think when you connect with other survivors, especially if you feel like you're helping other people, and you don't have to, I don't think anybody has to take the bad things that have happened to them and use them for any other purpose other than just survival or for their own healing. But for me personally, helping other people has been hugely healing.
Yeah, that's just so beautiful. And yeah, I relate to you, and so empowering. I can see that with what you've done with this. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You shared so vulnerably. So if people want to find you, your podcast, they just have to find psychotherapy.
Yes, 2 words, psychotherapy with Leah Denton.
Are you on Instagram? And
I am on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram at psycho.therapypodcast.
I can put the link to your podcast in the show notes.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been a real honor.
It's been a pleasure.